I stared at the screen, my fingers trembling as I held my phone. The words on the display felt foreign, as though someone else had written them, someone far removed from the reality I had built, the world I had carefully cultivated for years. My son's message was simple, yet its impact was catastrophic. "We don't want anything to do with you anymore. You made your choice." My breath caught in my throat, the words blurring together as my mind struggled to process them. I read the message again and again, willing it to change, but it stayed the same. The weight of the words pressed down on me, suffocating me as I tried to understand what had just happened. How could this be real? How could my child, my flesh and blood, say such things to me after everything? My hands shook uncontrollably, the phone slipping from my grasp and clattering against the floor. I barely noticed. I was frozen, my mind caught in a whirlwind of disbelief and pain. How could he say this to me? What had I done wrong? The answers remained just out of reach. Like a distant whisper in the dark, I bent down slowly, my knees shaken, and picked the phone up. My fingers fumbled with the screen as I tried to call him, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts, each one more frantic than the last. "Why won't you answer?" I thought. "Please, I need to hear your voice. I need to know why." What did I do? The phone rang and rang, but there was no answer, not a single sound on the other end. My pulse quickened, panic creeping in as I realized that it wasn't just the words on the screen that hurt. It was the silence that followed, the cold, unyielding silence that filled the space where my love for him had once resided. I sank down onto the couch, clutching the phone in my hands as though it were the only thing tethering me to reality. The room around me seemed to blur. The walls closed in, and all I could hear was the pounding of my heart. It was as though I were drowning in the weight of this unexpected betrayal, and I couldn't breathe. I thought of the years I had spent raising him, the sacrifices I made, the sleepless nights, the moments when I put my own needs aside, all for him, all for them, my children. I had given them everything, so how could they turn their backs on me so easily? How could they decide that I wasn't worth fighting for, that I wasn't worth their time or their love anymore? The tears came then, hot, angry tears that I couldn't hold back. I let them fall freely, my face buried in my hands. What am I supposed to do now? 1,000 questions swirled in my mind, but none of them had an answer. Where did I go wrong? I asked myself over and over. What could I have done differently? But no matter how hard I tried to make sense of it, the answers never came. I sat there for what felt like hours, unable to move, unable to think. My body felt like it belonged to someone else, a stranger who had wandered into my life and found herself lost in the wreckage. The phone in my hands felt heavier with each passing minute, as though the weight of the message itself was pressing down on my chest. In a daze, I picked up the phone again and tried calling him one more time. Maybe this time he would pick up. Maybe he would finally explain. But the phone rang, and once again, there was no answer. "Where are you?" I thought. "Why won't you speak to me?" The silence in the room was deafening. It was the kind of silence that felt like a void, a space where love once thrived, but now it was gone, replaced by something cold and unrecognizable. I wanted to scream, to shout, to demand answers, but the words stuck in my throat, caught between the hurt and the disbelief. I stood up slowly, my legs unsteady as I walked to the window. The world outside seemed so distant, so far removed from the turmoil inside me. I felt detached from it all, as though I were watching someone else's life unfold, not my own. The familiar sights of the street below, the people walking by, the cars driving past, felt like they belonged to a world I no longer understood. I thought back to all the years I had spent building a life for my children, to all the moments I had sacrificed for their well-being. I had always believed that the love I gave them would be enough, that no matter what happened, they would understand the depth of my devotion. But now, as I stood there, staring out at the world I had once thought I understood, I realized how naive I had been. My mind raced back to my own childhood, the struggles, the pain, the sacrifices my parents had made for me. I had always promised myself that I would do better, that I would give my children everything they needed. But now, standing here in the aftermath of their rejection, I couldn't help but wonder if it had all been for nothing. Was I wrong, I wondered? Was I too much? The questions haunted me, but no answers came. I was left alone, drowning in the weight of my own confusion and sorrow. I thought of reaching out to someone, anyone, just to hear a comforting voice, but I hesitated. The people I would normally turn to seemed so distant now, so far removed from the person I had become in this moment. Even my closest friends, my family, felt like strangers. So I stood there in the silence of my home, feeling the crushing weight of abandonment. The world outside continued to move, but inside I felt frozen in place, trapped in this moment of unrelenting pain. And yet, as I stood there, staring out into the unknown, something inside me began to shift. A small, quiet voice deep within whispered, "You have to keep going. You have to find a way through this." It was the first hint of something resembling hope, but it was faint, so faint that I wasn't sure if it was real or just the echo of a memory from a time when things were simpler. As I stared out into the world, I realized that the answers wouldn't come today. They wouldn't come tomorrow either. But I had to start somewhere. I had to begin understanding what had gone wrong, what had led me here. And with that thought, the first cracks of something new began to form within me, a quiet resolve buried beneath the shock, the pain, and the loneliness. I didn't know where it would lead, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to give up. Not yet. But as I turned away from the window and walked back into the silence of my home, I couldn't help but wonder, where had my children gone? And why was I the one left standing here alone? The pain of the unknown was almost unbearable, but it was all I had. And so I let it fill me. For now, the phone still sat there, the words from my son echoing in my mind. Even after all this time, the sting hadn't faded. It hadn't even begun to dull. My hands were no longer shaking, but the emptiness that had settled in my chest felt like it was growing, consuming everything. I thought I had spent years preparing for a life of unconditional love and sacrifice for my children, but in the wake of his rejection, I found myself questioning everything. I could no longer remember the face of the woman I thought I had become. My reflection in the mirror seemed like a stranger now. As I sat there, the silence pressing down on me, my mind wandered back, not to the present, but to a time long before the message, a time when I had first learned the weight of rejection. I was young then, too young to understand that love wasn't something to be earned through endless giving, but I didn't know that then. I spent my childhood chasing something that seemed impossible to grasp, my parents' attention. It wasn't that they didn't love me, it was that their love felt like an abstract concept, something they gave only when it suited them. My mother, always lost in her own world of troubles and her own pain, never seemed to have room for mine. My father was distant, a man who worked tirelessly, but never once paused to look me in the eyes and ask how my day had gone. My siblings, too wrapped up in their own lives, barely noticed the small girl in the corner, always trying to be good, trying to be perfect. I was young, but I quickly learned that perfection was the only currency in my house. If I could be perfect, if I could be what they wanted, perhaps I could make them notice me. I thought that if I got straight A's, if I did everything they asked without question, they would love me. That was the kind of love I knew, conditional, transactional. I had to work for it, I had to deserve it. But no matter how hard I tried, it was never enough. There was always a new standard, a new bar set impossibly high. And as I grew older, the reality settled in like a cold blanket. I would never be enough. I would never be loved in the way I wanted, in the way I needed. It wasn't until later, much later, that I understood what had been missing. I had spent my entire childhood striving for a love that was never truly mine to claim. My parents, lost in their own emotional struggles, couldn't give me what I so desperately needed: affection, attention, validation. They didn't have it in them, and I didn't have the words to ask for it. By the time I was a teenager, I had learned the hard way that love wasn't something that just appeared. It had to be fought for, and even then it was fragile. I found myself in relationships, my first relationships, where I thought I could find what was missing. But those relationships were just reflections of what I already knew. Love, when it came, was fleeting. It was a fantasy I could never quite touch. I remember my first boyfriend. He was everything I thought I needed: gentle, kind, and full of promises. I poured all my love into him, hoping that he would fill the empty spaces inside me. I gave him everything, just like I had given my parents everything. But he couldn't see me, not really. And when the time came, he left, leaving behind only the wreckage of yet another broken dream. It felt familiar, like the love I had always chased, always given, only to watch it slip through my fingers, and so I learned. I learned that no matter how hard I tried, no matter how much I gave, love didn't always return the way I needed it to. When I had my own children, I promised myself that I would be different. I promised myself that they would never feel the way I had felt as a child. They would never feel invisible. They would always know how much I loved them. I swore that my love would never be conditional. It would be enough no matter what. And so I gave everything to them. Everything. I worked hard to provide them with a comfortable life, to ensure they never wanted for anything. I didn't want them to experience the loneliness I had felt. I didn't want them to ever feel like they had to earn my love. I wanted them to feel secure, to know that they were worth everything. But somewhere along the way, something shifted. Maybe it was when I started to neglect myself, my own needs, my own desires, in the pursuit of giving them everything they could possibly want. Maybe it was when I forgot that love wasn't just about giving. It was about receiving too, about balance. I look back now and I realize that in my desperate attempt to give them everything, I became invisible to myself. I lost pieces of who I was, pieces I had never learned to love. I gave and I gave and I gave. But what I didn't realize was that love, true love, couldn't just be one-sided. It couldn't just be about what I was willing to sacrifice. In my efforts to ensure they never felt the pain I had known, I inadvertently created a different kind of pain. I had allowed them to take me for granted, to think that my love was something they could count on without ever truly seeing me. And now, standing in the aftermath of their rejection, I couldn't help but wonder, did I go too far? Had my love, my devotion made them blind to the woman I had become? Did I lose myself in the process of giving everything to them? I could feel the weight of it heavy on my chest. The past, with all its struggles and sacrifices, came flooding back. I wasn't just a mother to them. I was someone who had once been a little girl, longing for love, longing to be seen. Now, as I watched my children pull away, I couldn't help but ask myself, had I done enough? The doubt settled in, not just about my children, but about everything. Everything I had done, everything I had given. Was I just chasing shadows, hoping for a love that would never come? And as the memories of my childhood lingered, I realized that perhaps my greatest mistake was thinking I could give my children the love I had never received. Because in trying to give them what I lacked, I had forgotten to give them what they truly needed, to see me, to love me, not just because of what I gave, but because of who I was. In that moment, the truth began to sink in. Perhaps it wasn't just them I had failed. Maybe it was me too. And with that thought, I felt a shift, a deep, painful realization that maybe, just maybe, my own history was repeating itself. But the question remained, could I change it? Could I somehow rewrite the story before it was too late? As I drifted deeper into my memories, the answer seemed further away than ever. The feeling of disbelief lingered in my chest, growing heavier with every passing day. It wasn't just the rejection from my son anymore. Something more insidious had begun to take root in my life. I began to notice small changes, things I hadn't quite understood at first, but which, upon reflection, were becoming increasingly hard to ignore. It started with the little things, the comments that weren't really comments, but veiled jabs. "It must be nice to have so much free time," my daughter said one afternoon, her voice dripping with a bitterness I hadn't heard before. "I wish I had the luxury of just sitting around." Her eyes met mine for a brief moment before she quickly looked away, as though she had said nothing at all. But I could feel the sting, the weight of her words pressing down on me. At first, I told myself I was overreacting. I chalked it up to stress, to the inevitable struggles every family faces. But it wasn't just that one remark. It kept happening. Subtle digs here and there, a silent judgment that hung in the air, suffocating me. They didn't need to say much to hurt me. The silence between us spoke louder than any words ever could. Then came the first real blow, a financial request that would mark the beginning of my gradual unraveling. My son, who had been distant for so long, called one evening. I answered, half expecting him to ignore my calls again. But this time his voice was urgent, almost pleading. "Mom, I need some help with my rent, and I've been short on cash this month, and you know I can't get by without your help." His voice was calm, controlled, but there was an underlying expectation that I would help him, that I had no choice. The old fear stirred in my chest, fear of rejection, fear of disappointing him again. I didn't think twice. "Of course," I said before I could stop myself. "How much do you need?" I transferred the money the next day, not because I had it in abundance, but because I couldn't bear the thought of him struggling. I told myself it was just temporary, that I could handle it. After all, wasn't this what I had always done? Didn't I spend my life giving everything to my children, even if it meant sacrificing my own peace of mind? But the next time he called, it was with the same tone, the same subtle expectation. "Hey, I need a little more. This time it's for a car repair. Can you help me out?" At first, I hesitated. I'd already given so much, and yet it never seemed enough. But I couldn't say no. The old pattern, the need to prove my worth, to be the mother who always came through, drove me to transfer the money once more. In the back of my mind, I felt the first stirrings of doubt buzz. Why was this so easy for him? Why was I the one who always had to give? But the question was buried beneath layers of guilt and the instinctive desire to avoid confrontation. Then came the silent treatments, the moments when they would withhold their affection, using silence as their weapon. My daughter wouldn't answer my texts for days, leaving me anxiously waiting for her to acknowledge me. My son, when I tried to call, would let the phone ring until it went to voicemail. They didn't have to say a word to hurt me. The silence was enough to make my chest tighten, to make me feel invisible, useless. The more I gave, the less they seemed to care. And yet, they would demand more attention, more time, more money, more of me. I began to see the subtle manipulation taking shape. They were using my love for them against me, weaponizing my emotions to keep me in a perpetual state of giving, of self-sacrifice. I felt like I was slowly losing control of my life. Every act of kindness, every gesture of love seemed to be met with an insatiable demand for more, and I was powerless to stop it. It was then that I began to wonder, was this really love? Was this what it meant to be a mother? To give endlessly, only to be taken for granted, to be used until I was empty? But the worst part wasn't the money or the silence or even the manipulation. It was the growing sense of isolation. They didn't need me. They didn't care about me in the way I'd cared about them. The realization hit me like a brick wall. I was alone. I tried to reach out, tried to find solace in friends or distant relatives, but every attempt seemed to fall short. No one truly understood. They couldn't see the subtle cruelty, the way my children's behavior had slowly chipped away at me. They couldn't see that the isolation I felt was self-imposed, a result of the walls my children had built around me, brick by brick. And yet, despite everything, I continued to give. I continued to offer my love, even when I knew deep down that it was no longer wanted, no longer needed. I was stuck in a cycle, a loop of abuse that I didn't know how to break free from. The question haunted me, was it possible to save our relationship? The internal struggle intensified. Part of me wanted to fight for them, to fight for the family I had envisioned, the one I had worked so hard to build. But another part of me, one that had started to wake up to the truth, realized that maybe it was time to let go. Maybe they needed to find their own way without me constantly enabling them, without me constantly sacrificing myself for their benefit. I couldn't keep living in this toxic environment where my love was used as a bargaining chip. I needed something more. I needed peace. And as the weight of that realization began to settle in, I found myself at a crossroads. The choice wasn't clear yet, but I knew one thing. I couldn't keep going like this. Something had to change. And so, with a heavy heart, I began to explore the possibility of a new path. A path that didn't involve constant giving, a path where I could learn to love myself without guilt, without fear. It was terrifying to even consider, but deep down I knew it was the only way forward. The weight of my heart's rupture was unbearable. It felt as though my soul was unraveling, thread by thread, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't seem to stitch it back together. The betrayal from my children had cut deeper than I ever imagined possible. The once warm, nurturing love I had given them had now turned into a blade that pierced through my very core. The emptiness I felt in the wake of their rejection was all-consuming, and everything I had ever believed about family, love, and sacrifice seemed to be slipping away. I tried to reach out to friends, acquaintances, anyone who might understand, but their reactions were as cold as the silence I had grown so accustomed to from my children. Some of them offered words of comfort, but they felt hollow, distant. It was as though they were all too afraid to get involved, too unsure of how to navigate the mess that my life had become. It was the same sense of isolation I had felt from my children, only now it stretched beyond the walls of my home and surrounded me like an invisible fog. The loneliness seemed to get worse each day. I spent countless hours lying awake at night, my thoughts spiraling into darkness. How had it come to this? How could they do this to me? The questions kept coming, but they offered no answers. There were no apologies, no explanations, only silence, only rejection. I'd given everything I had, and yet it was never enough. I needed help. I needed someone to talk to, someone who could help me make sense of all this pain. So I made the decision to seek professional help. I made an appointment with a psychologist, hoping that perhaps speaking to a stranger, someone who was trained to understand such deep wounds, would offer me the relief I so desperately needed. The first few sessions were uncomfortable. The words I tried to express tangled up in the mess of emotions I couldn't even begin to untangle. But slowly, the psychologist started to peel back the layers, asking me questions that forced me to confront the raw, painful truth. Why had I allowed this to happen? Why had I given so much of myself only to be discarded? As I spoke, I began to realize something. I'd always believed that love was enough, that if I just loved my children enough, they would return that love unconditionally. But love, I was learning, wasn't something that could be demanded. It wasn't a currency to be exchanged. And yet, I had spent so many years giving, without ever asking if it was what they truly needed. But even after several sessions, there was no relief. The pain hadn't dulled. If anything, it was growing sharper. The guilt I felt only intensified. I had been trying to fix everything for so long, to keep my family together, to create the love that I had never received. But what had I missed in the process? What had I overlooked in my desire to give everything to them? The more I thought about it, the more I realized I had made a terrible mistake. My love, my devotion to them had become overwhelming. It had become a cage, both for me and for them. I had smothered them with it, and they had responded not with appreciation, but with rejection. The physical toll of all this stress began to manifest in my body. I hadn't slept properly in days, maybe weeks. The constant worry, the constant heartache wore me down until I couldn't even recognize myself. I was always exhausted, my body ached, my energy reserves were completely depleted. Every morning, it felt like it took every ounce of strength just to get out of bed. And even then, I couldn't shake the heaviness that clung to me like a second skin. In the midst of all this pain, I started to question myself, my actions, my choices, everything. Could I have done something differently? Could I have been a better mother, a better person? Had my love for my children been too much, too overwhelming for them? These thoughts gnawed at me relentlessly, pulling me deeper into the darkness. I couldn't escape them. I couldn't escape the feeling that I had somehow failed, not only as a mother, but as a human being. My sense of self-worth was crumbling piece by piece, and I felt like I was spiraling out of control. I was losing the battle, losing myself. The guilt weighed heavily on me, and yet a part of me wondered, is this what they wanted? Was I supposed to just give up and let them be free of me? Let them live their lives without the burden of my expectations, my love? But then another realization hit me like a jolt of electricity. No, I couldn't just disappear. I couldn't simply fade into the background and let them decide for me. I'd given so much, and yet I still had more to give, to myself. I started to imagine a different path, one where I didn't have to keep fighting for their love. A path where I could learn to love myself, where I could stop pouring my energy into people who didn't appreciate it. It wasn't going to be easy. The pain was still raw, the scars still fresh. But as I sat in that psychologist's office, I realized something. I couldn't keep living like this. I couldn't keep holding on to something that wasn't coming back. And so I made a decision. It wasn't a sudden epiphany, but a quiet understanding that I had reached a turning point. I had to change. I had to let go. It wasn't about giving up. It was about giving myself the chance to heal, to rebuild. The path ahead was uncertain, and I had no idea where it would lead, but I knew one thing: I couldn't keep living in the past. I had to step into the future, even if it meant leaving behind the family I'd always dreamed of. And with that thought, something inside me shifted. It wasn't the end of the road, but the beginning of something new. I couldn't go back to the way things were, but I was finally ready to step forward, to find my own peace no matter where it took me. The road ahead wasn't easy, but it was mine to walk. And for the first time in a long while, I was ready to take that first step. I walked into the room, my heart pounding in my chest. The air was thick with the kind of silence that only comes from people who know they are not alone in their pain. The group was small, just a handful of women, each with their own stories etched deeply into their faces. Some were older, their eyes tired from years of suffering. Others were younger, still carrying the remnants of their battles with them. But they all shared one thing, a history of abuse and the courage to step into this room, hoping for a chance at something different. I'd been through the darkest period of my life, but I knew something had to change. I couldn't keep living in that vacuum of pain, that pit of isolation where my thoughts spiraled endlessly, consuming me. I couldn't stay locked in my own sadness. So I made the decision to join a support group for survivors of abuse. I wasn't sure what to expect, but I knew I needed to try. As I sat down, I could feel my walls slowly begin to crumble. There was something about the vulnerability in the room, the shared understanding that began to work on me. Each woman spoke in turn, telling her story with raw honesty, some of their voices shaking, others steady, but all of them carrying the weight of their experiences. It was like hearing my own pain echoed in the voices of strangers, yet somehow it didn't feel like a threat. It felt like release. One woman in particular spoke with a quiet strength that drew me in. Her name was Sarah, and her story was one of struggle and survival, just like mine. She talked about her children, how they had turned their backs on her, just like mine had done, and I felt my heart break all over again. Her voice cracked as she described the coldness in their eyes, the same coldness that had been in my own children's eyes when they rejected me. But what struck me most wasn't the pain in her story, it was the resilience. She wasn't just talking about her sorrow, she was talking about her survival, her fight to reclaim herself after everything had been taken away. She spoke about finding strength in herself, in the small moments of joy, and in the women who had become her support system. I thought I was alone, she said, her eyes meeting mine. I thought I was the only one who had lost everything. But then I found people who understood, people who saw me, and it wasn't easy, but it was a start. And that's what we have to hold on to, a start. Her words sank deep into me, like a seed planted in the soil of my despair. I hadn't realized how badly I needed to hear them until they echoed in the quiet of my own mind. A start. That's all I had needed. A starting point, a tiny spark of hope to reignite the possibility of healing. And here, surrounded by these women, I saw that hope beginning to take shape. As the weeks passed, I found myself returning to the group, drawn not only by the support they gave, but by the strength that came from knowing I wasn't alone. We began to share more about our past, our scars, our hopes. Slowly, I started to rebuild myself piece by piece. The bitterness of my children's betrayal, the isolation I'd felt for so long, started to soften, even if just a little. I was no longer fighting to prove something to anyone. For the first time, I was fighting for myself. But even in this space of support and healing, I found myself facing another challenge. One of the women, Elena, became a close friend. She was quiet, reflective, and had a deep sense of kindness about her that had made her easy to talk to. But as we spent more time together, I realized that her situation mirrored mine in some ways. Her children, like mine, had distanced themselves from her, and she too felt the gnawing pain of rejection. It was like watching my own fear mirrored back at me. One afternoon after our group meeting had ended, Elena and I sat together in the quiet room, sipping coffee. She looked at me with a sadness in her eyes that I knew all too well. "I don't know if I can forgive them," she said softly, her voice trembling. "I've given everything. I've always been there, and now they're just gone. I don't know how to make sense of it." I nodded, the ache in my chest growing as I thought about my own children. Can I forgive them, I thought. Can I really forgive them for all they've done? "I don't know if I can either," I replied, my voice just above a whisper. "But I'm learning that it's okay not to have all the answers right now. I'm learning that maybe I don't have to have it all figured out. I can just exist, and in time, maybe I'll understand." Elena smiled at me, a small, sad smile, but it was a smile nonetheless. "You're stronger than you think," she said. Her words lingered with me long after I left that day. Stronger than I think. Could it be true? Could I really be stronger than I thought? Could I find the strength to heal, to move forward, to let go of the past and embrace a future that wasn't defined by my children's rejection? In the days that followed, I found myself questioning everything. I thought about the lessons I had learned in the group, the resilience, the importance of self-love, the understanding that healing was not a straight path, but a winding, complicated journey. But there was still that nagging fear, the thought that I couldn't escape, the thought that I was destined to repeat the same cycle of rejection. My mind kept returning to the image of my children, their cold faces, their indifference. And then one evening, as I sat by the phone, contemplating whether I should try to reach out to them again, it rang. My heart skipped a beat as I saw the caller ID. It was my son. I hesitated before answering, my hand trembling as I lifted the phone to my ear. "Mom?" His voice was quiet, tentative. I've been thinking. I'm sorry for everything. I don't know what to say, but I miss you." My breath caught in my throat, the words I had waited so long to hear. But even as they filled the space between us, I felt the weight of the moment. It wasn't a resolution, not yet, not fully, but it was a start, and maybe that's all I needed. As I sat there, hearing the cracks of a potential reconciliation, I realized something. Perhaps healing wasn't about waiting for my children to come back to me fully. Maybe it was about letting go, about finding peace within myself, even before I had all the answers. The road ahead was still uncertain, the pain was still raw, but for the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to feel something else, a glimmer of hope. The days that followed my son's call were filled with quiet reflection. I'd allowed myself to breathe again, to embrace the faintest glimmer of hope that perhaps things could be different. Perhaps this time things would work out. But even as I moved forward, even as I built a new life for myself, the shadow of my past still lingered. And I couldn't escape the truth. Nothing had been resolved. My children were still out there, and I had no idea where we stood. Months passed, and with each new day, I felt stronger. I found comfort in the support of the women who had become my closest allies. I began to feel like I could finally be whole again, like I wasn't defined by my past mistakes or by the failures of my family. I had forged new connections, built new bridges, and in the process, I discovered a part of myself I'd long since buried, the woman who deserved to be happy, who deserved to be loved and supported. But one evening, as I was sitting in my living room, my phone rang. I didn't recognize the number, but something inside me told me to answer. As I did, I heard his voice. My son. "Mom, it's me." His voice sounded uncertain, fragile. "I know it's been a long time and I don't know how to start this, but we've been talking and we want to come back. We want to be a family again." My heart skipped a beat. I had been waiting for this moment, hoping for this moment. But now that it was here, I felt a coldness creeping in, an instinctual hesitation. It wasn't just relief, it was confusion, fear, uncertainty. I had spent so long rebuilding myself, trying to break free from the chains that had bound me to them. And now they wanted to come back, but the words that followed made my stomach churn. "I know things have been hard, but if we're going to make this work, you'll have to leave the support you've found. You can't keep those relationships with those women. They're not your real family. You need to let them go if you want us back in your life." The words hit me like a slap. I felt the room close in around me. I hadn't realized until that moment how much I had come to depend on the women in my support group. Their kindness, their understanding, their unspoken bond. They had become my family, the people who saw me, the people who held me up when I felt like I was falling apart. And now my son was asking me to give all that up, to choose him, to choose the family that had already betrayed me over the support and connection I had built from scratch. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. Could I really do that? Could I really cut myself off from the people who had helped me heal? People who had given me the strength to keep going, to rebuild my life. I sat there in silence, the weight of his words settling over me like a heavy fog. I wanted to believe that this was the beginning of something beautiful, that this was my chance to fix what had been broken. But deep down I knew this wasn't the same as before. The family I had once known, the relationship I had desperately tried to hold on to, had changed. It wasn't just my children who had changed, it was me. I was no longer the same woman who had poured herself into them, willing to sacrifice everything for their love. But this felt like a test, one I wasn't sure I could pass. I thought about the pain, the rejection, the years of giving and given until there was nothing left for me. I thought about the isolation, the fear, the loneliness that had consumed me when they turned their backs. How could I go back to that? How could I erase the growth I had fought so hard for, the people who had helped me see my worth again? And yet, how could I ignore the pull of my children? How could I turn away from them again, knowing that part of me still loved them, still wanted them in my life? I was torn. I wanted to believe that this could be the moment I had waited for, the moment I could forgive them, heal our broken relationship, and rebuild what had been lost. But I wasn't sure I could make that sacrifice again, not after everything I had been through, not after everything I had learned. The internal battle raged inside me, each side pulling me in a different direction. One side, the old familiar side, told me to take them back, to offer my forgiveness, to try once again to make my family whole. But the other side, the side that had fought so hard to rebuild itself, to find new relationships, to protect my own peace, was telling me something different. It was telling me that I couldn't give up my happiness for the sake of people who had already shown me they didn't value me. The phone call ended, but the decision remained. I sat there in silence, the weight of my choice hanging over me. Would I choose the family that had rejected me, the family that had never truly understood me, or would I choose the life I had worked so hard to build, the new people who had become my support system, my lifeline? As the days passed, I continued to reflect. Every moment seemed like a crossroads, every decision fraught with consequences. But something inside me told me that I couldn't go back. I had to choose myself. I had to choose the peace I had found, the happiness that had slowly started to bloom within me. And if that meant saying goodbye to the dream of a perfect family, then so be it. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I made my decision. It wasn't easy and it wasn't without pain, but I knew it was the right choice. I sent a message to my son. It wasn't filled with anger or bitterness, but it was firm. I love you, but I can't give up the life I've started to build. I can't erase everything I've worked for, everything I've found. I'm sorry. It was the hardest thing I had ever done, but in that moment, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. It wasn't a perfect resolution. It wasn't the reunion I had once dreamed of, but it was my truth. And for the first time in a long while, I felt a sense of freedom. There are moments in life when the weight of a decision is so heavy, it feels like it might break you. Yet, in the same instant, there is a glimmer of something else, a strange, unfamiliar sense of freedom. That was the moment I stood at the crossroads, finally realizing that to heal, to truly move forward, I had to let go. Not just of my past, not just of the pain, but of the people who had caused me the most harm. It was the hardest thing I had ever done. I had spent so many years trying to keep my family together, trying to make things work despite the manipulation and betrayal. But now, after everything I had been through, after rebuilding myself piece by piece, I understood something that I hadn't before. My happiness did not depend on their love. My worth didn't come from their approval, from their acceptance, or from their ability to love me in return. It was mine. It always had been. I thought about the message from my son, the call I had made to set things right, the hope I had clung to that somehow, through it all, I could salvage something. I realized then that it wasn't about salvaging old relationships or forcing people into spaces they no longer fit. I had spent so much of my life sacrificing myself for a family that never fully appreciated me. It was time to change that. It was time to choose myself. The decision wasn't easy and it wasn't immediate. There were nights when I lay awake, my heart torn, my thoughts swirling in confusion. Could I really cut ties with my children? Was it truly the right choice? But with each passing day, the answer became clearer. My mind settled as I realized that I couldn't continue living for them. I couldn't live my life for anyone else. It was time to reclaim my own power, to own my happiness, to create a life that was defined by me, not by the people who had hurt me.